All right, so the first thing I want you to understand is what we told you before, that every function should be in a separate file, is not the only way to do it. In fact, you actually can put multiple functions in the same file. But there are restrictions that come with doing that, constraints. You need to understand those. This is why we want you to start out with external functions, because when you start using local functions, there are some subtleties you need to be aware of. And the main one is, why am I not getting the pen here? You know what, I think I have to change something. 1 second here. Let me see. Oh, there it is. Okay. The key thing is when you have multiple functions in a file, only the first one can be called externally. Okay, so in this example, this function f1, I could call from another file. Okay, if my main program's in another file, I can call f1. But these other two functions, min, max, and sqr, are local functions. They can only be called within the same file. Okay, so the basic idea is f1 is called by the main program that's in some other file, and then f1 might in turn call min, max, and sqr. So these are sometimes called helper functions, where there's a subtask that this function has to do, and just for the sake of organizing your program, it's easier to put it in a separate function. But you don't want anybody else calling this function except f1, so you put it in the same file. And actually, I've already shown you one of these. Let me find it real quick. I didn't point it out at the time, but if you go back to one of the previous examples, I gave you a function at one point called Roman 3. That takes a character array that represents a Roman number and determines its decimal value. If you look at the bottom, you see there's another function here called digit val. And this should look familiar because you did this as one of your exercises too. It just takes a single digit or character representing a single digit and returns the value of that digit. Okay, so that's a subtask that the main function here had to do. And I just found it convenient to put it in a separate function. Okay. And then you can see that function gets called somewhere here, right here, gets called by the main function more than once, which is why it was useful to put it in a function. All right, so Roman 3 is a main function. I can call it from the command line. That's just a path issue. I just need to set my current folder to be the one where this function resides. Okay, and I get value, but I cannot call digit val from the command line. Okay, unrecognized function. All right, so this is a local function, can only be called by Roman 3. Now, I'm not going to go through this example because it's kind of intricate. It takes some attention to follow. However, there is a recording embedded in the ebook, which I have open here somewhere. At least I think I do. If you go to the press books, yeah, and there's a link to this in today's module in Carmen. There's an embedded video here where I go through this lecture basically, and I go through this example in great detail. But the key point here that's important to get across, notice each of these functions has a variable called x. And the crucial point is those are all different variables. Okay, so this is something I've mentioned before. We call it the scope of a variable. This variable x only has meaning within the function f1. This variable x only has meaning within the function min-max. And this one only has meaning within SQR. And so 3 variables, they all happen to have the same name, but they're entirely separate variables. I always say it's like I had 3 students in my class named Bob. They all have the same name, but they're entirely different people. All right, so I go through in detail how to trace through this and determine what the value of x is within each function. And here's what you get. Okay, so if you were to do a disp x within f1, you'd see 1, 2, 3. It's being called like so. But if you did a disp x within min-max, you'd see 1, 4, 9. And if you did a disp x within SQR, you'd see -8. Okay, 3 different variables with different values. Now, one key thing here. So I said before that only the top function can be called externally. Everything else is just a local function. Well, that also applies if you put a script at the top of your file. So here's another way you could organize your program. Now, your main program could be up here as a script. Getting a little better at writing with a mouse, right? And then you have all of your functions as local functions in the same file. But it's important to understand, if you put even a single line of code before this first function definition, this is now a local function. Okay. Now all 3 of these functions are local functions. They can only be called by this main program. Okay, so this is why I told you when we introduce functions, never put anything before the function definition. That should always be the first thing in your file. So that's true if you're writing an external function. If the only thing in that function is going to be, or only thing in that file is going to be that one function definition, never put anything before the function line. But if you're doing it this way, where your script is going to be at the top, and then you put your local functions, okay, now the rule is it has to be the script at the top, and then the functions have to be at the bottom. Okay, so this now is your main program, and you can't put anything else here. Say at the bottom, no code here, at the bottom, or in between functions. Okay, you can't put anything, you can't have just bits of code hanging out in space here in between the function definitions. It either has to be in the script up at the top or within a function. Okay, anything else will give you errors. All right, so those are the 2 ways you can organize your programs as far as I'm concerned, right? You can either do it the way we did it previously. Your main program is in a script file. Each function is in a separate function file. Or your main program can be a script at the top of the file, and then the function definitions come after that at the bottom. All right. So you have a lot of choices you can make. You have a lot of flexibility here, but flexibility also creates complexity. So when you're deciding how to organize your program, you could do it one of the 2 ways I just said. Your main program could be a script, and then you have your functions in external files. Or you could have a main script and then local functions. But you can also combine them. You can have both external functions and local functions. Okay, so you could have your main program calling these external functions that are in separate files. Can also call these local functions that are in the same file. The local functions could even call the external functions. The external functions could call each other. The only thing that cannot happen, the external functions cannot call the local functions, okay? Because these local functions can only be called from within the same file. All right. Now, one more issue. Some people will even say you should never use scripts. Some people just don't like to use scripts. They say everything should be a function. I don't subscribe to that theory. But your main program could just be a function as well. Now, why would you do that? As far as I'm concerned, the only time you would make your main program a function instead of a script is if you want to pass arguments to it. Okay? Otherwise, I think the most straightforward thing to do, your main program is a script and it calls one or more functions, which can be either external or local, whichever you're more comfortable with.